I didn't ruin my life in one terrible decision. That would have been easier to forgive. I didn't make a dramatic mistake or fall into obvious self-destruction. I did something far more subtle and far more permanent. I let my life happen to me. If you're listening to this, you might think you would notice when that starts. You imagine alarms, discomfort, panic. But it doesn't work that way. It begins with relief. With choosing the easier option once. Then again. Then calling it practicality. Over time, that relief turns into routine, and routine quietly replaces intention. I used to believe that as long as nothing was actively wrong, everything was fine. I measured my life by the absence of disaster. No scandals. No catastrophes. No obvious failures. From the outside, my life looked stable, respectable, even enviable to some. And that was the trap. Because when a life looks acceptable, no one questions whether it's meaningful. I remember when decisions used to feel heavy. When choosing a path meant closing others, and that mattered. At some point, decisions became softer, blurrier. I stopped choosing and started agreeing. Agreeing to timelines. Agreeing to expectations. Agreeing to futures that sounded reasonable but felt strangely empty when I imagined myself inside them. I told myself I was being patient. That my time would come. That someday I would do the things I postponed. But someday is a dangerous word. It sounds hopeful, but it demands nothing. It lets you delay your own life indefinitely without admitting that you're afraid to live it. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into years. I marked time by obligations instead of memories. Workdays blurred together. Conversations repeated themselves with different faces. I laughed at the right moments, nodded at familiar complaints, participated in rituals that no longer touched me. Slowly, I became excellent at playing my role and terrible at listening to myself. There were signs, of course. There always are. A dull heaviness when I woke up. A strange sense of loss with no clear cause. The feeling that I was always preparing for something that never arrived. But I learned how to silence those signals. I distracted myself. I stayed busy. I convinced myself that this quiet dissatisfaction was normal, even mature. I watched other people change. I watched them leave, fail, restart, reinvent themselves. I admired them publicly and judged them privately. I told myself they were reckless, unstable, unrealistic. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. They were doing something I was too afraid to do. They were choosing. My life became a series of default settings. When something ended, I replaced it with the closest equivalent. When opportunities appeared, I asked not whether I wanted them, but whether they made sense. Sense became my guiding principle. And slowly, without noticing, I stopped feeling anything deeply at all. I didn't hate my life. That's what made it so dangerous. Hatred motivates change. Pain demands attention. But numbness is polite. It lets you function. It lets you survive indefinitely while quietly erasing you. At night, I would sometimes imagine an alternative version of myself. Not a fantasy hero, not someone extraordinary. Just me, but honest. Me saying no when I meant no. Me leaving when staying felt wrong. Me choosing discomfort over emptiness. Those thoughts didn't inspire me. They exhausted me. Because deep down, I knew they were possible, and I was avoiding them on purpose. I told myself I had responsibilities. I told myself other people mattered more. I told myself wanting more was selfish. Those stories worked for a long time. Until one evening, standing alone in a familiar room, I felt a thought surface that I couldn't push away. If nothing changes, this is my entire life. The thought wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. A cold, steady understanding that I was not moving toward anything. I was simply aging inside a pattern I had never consciously chosen. That realization didn't break me immediately. It followed me. It sat beside me during conversations. It walked with me through ordinary days. It asked quiet questions I could no longer ignore. Questions about time. About agency. About whether a life that never truly begins can ever be said to end. For the first time, I understood that regret doesn't always come from what you did wrong. Sometimes it comes from everything you never dared to do at all. And once that understanding settles in, it changes the way you see every moment that follows. After that realization, I started noticing time in a way I never had before. Not hours or days, but distance. The distance between who I was and who I could have been. It wasn't dramatic at first. It showed up in small, almost embarrassing moments. Standing in a store unable to choose anything because I no longer trusted my own preferences. Hearing myself say I don't mind so often that it felt like my personality had been reduced to a polite shrug. I realized how often I had outsourced my decisions. To circumstances. To expectations. To what seemed reasonable. Somewhere along the way, I had confused adaptability with identity. I thought being flexible meant being mature, when in reality I had just stopped having edges. There was a particular memory that kept resurfacing. A moment years earlier when I had felt a sharp, undeniable urge to change direction. I remembered the physical sensation of it, like standing at the edge of something unknown. I remembered how alive I felt in that moment. And I remembered how quickly I talked myself out of it. Not because it was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. That pattern repeated itself throughout my life. Each time, the voice of caution grew louder and the voice of desire grew quieter. Eventually, I stopped hearing it altogether. That scared me more than any bad outcome ever could have. I began to feel like an observer in my own existence. I showed up, performed, fulfilled expectations, then retreated inward. My life continued to function smoothly while my inner world stagnated. People praised my reliability, my calm, my consistency. They had no idea those traits were built on avoidance. There was a kind of grief that settled in, but it had no clear object. I wasn't mourning a person or an event. I was mourning potential. I was mourning the courage I never exercised, the risks I never took, the versions of myself that remained hypothetical forever. I tried to talk myself out of it again. I reminded myself of everything that was fine. Of the ways my life could have been worse. Of how ungrateful it would sound to complain. But gratitude used as a weapon against honesty becomes another form of self-betrayal. I could acknowledge what I had without denying what I lacked. The idea of starting over felt ridiculous. I wasn't young enough to believe reinvention would be easy, and I wasn't broken enough to justify it to others. That placed me in an uncomfortable middle space. Too functional to escape, too empty to stay asleep. I noticed how often I delayed things that mattered to me personally. Creative ideas, private interests, quiet dreams. I treated them as optional, as luxuries to be addressed only after everything else was taken care of. Everything else was never finished. There was also fear. Not of failing publicly, but of discovering that even if I tried, I might still feel this emptiness. At least in my current life, the numbness had an explanation. Changing and remaining unfulfilled would remove my last excuse. I reached a point where distraction stopped working. Noise no longer drowned out the questions. Entertainment felt hollow. Productivity felt pointless. I could complete tasks flawlessly and still feel like nothing meaningful had occurred. One night, lying awake, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If no one was watching, if no one would judge the outcome, what would I actually want to do with my life? The answer didn't come immediately. That silence was devastating. It revealed how long I had gone without asking myself anything real. But slowly, faintly, Something surfaced. Not a detailed plan. Not a grand vision. Just a feeling. A pull toward honesty. Toward making choices that felt internally aligned, even if they made no sense externally. That was when I understood that my real fear wasn't change. It was responsibility. Because choosing your own life means owning its consequences, without hiding behind circumstance or expectation. I wasn't ready to act yet. But I was no longer asleep. And once awareness arrives, it demands something from you eventually. I knew then that continuing exactly as I was would require an active decision. And for the first time, doing nothing no longer felt neutral. It felt like a choice to disappear slowly, with my eyes open. That was the moment the quiet urgency began, not panic. Not drama. Just the steady understanding that time was no longer waiting for me to become brave. The moment I accepted that doing nothing was still a choice, I couldn't hide behind comfort anymore. Every familiar routine began to feel heavier, not because it was difficult, but because it was deliberate now. I was no longer unaware. I was participating. That awareness didn't make me brave overnight. It made me painfully honest. I saw how many days I had traded for predictability. How often I had chosen safety not because it protected me, but because it protected me from myself. From questions I didn't want to answer. From desires I didn't want to justify. I didn't announce my change to anyone. There was nothing to announce. Change didn't arrive as a dramatic exit or a bold declaration. It arrived quietly, in private moments where I stopped silencing myself. Where I paused before agreeing. Where I allowed discomfort instead of immediately smoothing it over. The first real choice I made felt almost insignificant from the outside. But inside, it shook something loose. It was the first time in years I had acted not because it was expected, but because it felt true. That moment didn't bring instant happiness. It brought something better. Presence. Presence is unsettling when you're not used to it. It strips away excuses. You can no longer blame your dissatisfaction on vague circumstances. You begin to see your life as something actively shaped, even by small decisions. Especially by small decisions. I began to notice myself returning. Slowly. In fragments. In preferences I had forgotten I had. In opinions that didn't automatically soften themselves to keep peace. In moments of quiet satisfaction that came not from approval, but from alignment. There were still days when fear whispered that I was making a mistake. That I should return to the familiar numbness. That at least it was predictable. But I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I had felt what it was like to choose honestly, and going back felt like lying on purpose. I learned that starting over doesn't always mean leaving everything behind. Sometimes it means staying, but no longer abandoning yourself in the process. Sometimes it means redefining success in a way that no one else applauds. I stopped waiting for permission to live differently. I stopped assuming that clarity would arrive before action. It doesn't. Clarity comes after movement, not before. You learn who you are by watching what you choose when comfort and truth are no longer aligned. Not everything improved. Some relationships became strained. Some people didn't recognize me anymore. I was no longer as convenient, as predictable, as easy to place. That loss hurt. But it hurt differently than regret. It hurt honestly. I don't claim that my life is now extraordinary. It isn't. But it is intentional. And intention changes everything. Even ordinary moments feel heavier when they're chosen, even quiet days feel meaningful when they belong to you. I still think about the years I let slip by. About the time I want to get back. That sadness doesn't disappear. It shouldn't. It reminds me why awareness matters. Why delaying your life is not harmless. If you're listening to this and feel a familiar stillness, a sense that time is moving faster than your choices, I want to tell you what to do. There is no universal escape, No single right path. But I will tell you this. A life you don't choose will still demand everything from you. Your energy. Your time. Your attention. The difference is that it won't give you yourself in return. I let my life happen for a long time. I confused endurance with purpose. I mistook comfort for meaning. I don't know exactly where my path leads now. But I know this. I am no longer waiting for my life to begin. I am finally the one walking into it.